Hello everyone, welcome to Macroeconomics Unit 2 by Bizinstitution. So let's look at what are we going to learn today in Unit 2. So first we're going to talk about the circular flow model and basically which is how businesses, households, and the government interact. Then we move on to the GDP and its limitations. I'm sure you've heard about GDP before, what it is, how it's calculated, and some of its limitations. Then we're going to talk about unemployment, what exactly is it, what are the different types of it. And then we're going to talk about inflation and the business cycle. So let's get started. So topic one, the circular flow model. So what is the circular flow model? Well, basically, if you look at it, it's basically what it's the connects households to firms. Now, how does it do that? Well, I'll explain the whole thing, as you can see with the diagram right there. Households purchase goods and services from businesses in the product market. Businesses need resources and get it from the factor markets, which provide land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, which is the factors of production we talked about in the last video. And this all these factors of production come from the households. The circle also goes the other way, around in which households gives money to the product market, who pass it on to revenue to firms and businesses. Businesses cannot keep all this revenue as they have to pay for the operation costs to the factor markets, which go to households as income. There are four types of factors of income: rent, wages, interest, and profit. However, this only covers the private sector. The government is also involved in the circular flow model, as we can see. The government buys goods and services from the product market, and this is known as government spending. It is the same with resource, but instead obviously purchases resources. The government also interacts with firms and households by giving them subsidies, public goods, and welfare. They get taxes in return for these goods and services. So that's basically the circular flow model. Going on to the second topic, it's talking about GDP and its limitations. So first of all, what is GDP? Well, GDP is a monetary value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders in 1 year. So it's basically what GDP is trying to show is basically the higher the GDP, that means the better your economy is. Well, the better the country is running, that means there's good jobs. It kind of is trying to give you an estimation of how the situation of a country's economy and is it producing at its max. It's just another way, another number that economists look at basically. So well, there's three ways to calculate GDP, and let's go through all of them. The first one is the expenditures approach. It basically adds up all the spending done in the economy by the households, businesses, the government, and other countries too. So how does it do that? As we can see over here, the formula is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Well, those letters probably don't make sense, but if you think about it, C is consumer spending. So as households, basically, what do they spend? Investment spending, which is I, which is basically businesses. Then government spending for G, basically. And then X minus M. So what is X minus M? X minus M basically equals to net exports. X is how many exports and minus how many imports you have. Basically, you get that, and if you calculate that, you get the expenditures approach. Then there's also an income approach, which basically adds up all the income earned, including rent, wages, profit, and interest. Oh, and over here, as you can see, this is wages, this is rent, this is interest, and PR stands for profit. And the third and final one is value added approach, which is basically adding a dollar value at each step of the production process. So, well, how does the value added approach work? So, example, if you were making a car, for example, the expenditures approach would just add that in whoever buys the car. For example, I go and buy the car, it would just add that as consumer spending. The value added approach, however, will add everything of every step of that. For example, when companies make the tires, the body of the car. So each step that gets added on, they keep adding the value to that. The most common one that most economists use to calculate GDP is the expenditures approach, which is on the top over here. Now you may wonder, now the next thing I kind of wanted to focus on is nominal versus real GDP. As you may know, in this world, there's a thing called inflation. As time goes on, prices go up, basically. So if prices go up, then wouldn't that mean that GDP will always stay up or always be higher than the previous years? But that wouldn't exactly show if the economy is growing or not. So basically, there's two types of GDP. Nominal GDP, which just does not account for inflation, it's just that year prices and that year's quantity of goods. Whereas real GDP accounts for inflation by using one base year. So, for example, you were trying to compare 2010 and 2011 GDP. Real GDP would keep 2010 as its base year and use that prices to calculate the 2011 GDP. Now, there's also some limitations of the GDP. So, there's goods that it doesn't count or that doesn't come in any of its approaches, basically. So it doesn't count intermediate goods, basically, which are like since GDP only includes final goods, it only includes the finished car. It won't include radio and tires unless you're using the value added approach, which is again not really used that often. So it doesn't really include the every step of it, or like it doesn't include, basically it doesn't give you a whole view of the whole economy. It doesn't talk about how the company that produces tires. It also doesn't include non-production transactions or financial transactions, basically, which are stocks, bonds, or real estate. This isn't like, which is an important part of the economy. That's not part of GDP actually. And then it also doesn't count non-market activities, which is basically illegal production or illegal labor that behind the scenes. Even though it is illegal, it's still technically part of the economy, and GDP does not add that. Topic three: unemployment. So basically, before I go, who is unemployed or what is exactly considered as unemployed in macroeconomics? So one is said to be unemployed if they're actively looking for a job and currently do not have one. So actively looking for jobs, that could be a bit misleading. But how the U.S. runs it is it goes about, if a person has been looking for a job in the last 4 weeks, then they're considered unemployed. Or but if you stop looking for a job and you do not have a job, then you are actually considered a discouraged worker and you are unemployed. So that's how that's an important thing to know for the. I'll talk about that in a few slides. So there are a few calculations that we need to know. The labor force participation rate, which is the first is the labor force, which consists of all unemployed and all the employed people in a population, or the population over 16, basically everyone who can work, times 100. You get how many people are actually participating in the workforce. So the more people participating, the more likely it is that the company is producing more goods and services. There's also the unemployment rate, which just looks at the unemployed people over the labor force only. That means over the unemployed plus employed people times 100. This gives you an idea of out of the people that can work, how many are unemployed. Obviously, if this number is high, the economy isn't producing as efficiently as it can. Now, there's also three types of unemployment that you need to know. There's frictional unemployment, structural unemployment, and cyclical unemployment. So let's go through each of them. So frictional is basically temporarily unemployed and the process of finding a new job. So for example, I'm currently at a company A and I'm looking for a job that gives me a higher salary. So I see company B can offer me that. So I go to company B and I left company A for a while. There's a small period that takes you from transitioning from company A to company B. Well, technically, I do not have a job in that small period, so I'm considered unemployed when I'm in actuality, I'm not. I'm just transitioning jobs. So that's that. Frictional employment is actually a good type of unemployment. It just means that you're trying to find a new job or it's temporarily not employed. Then there's structural unemployment. Well, this is unemployment due to labor changes or just the way a company operates. Your skills are no longer required. For example, manufacturing workers have bad experiences in around the 1900s, and when more technology and the industrial revolution came and more tools and technology started being used in factories, a lot of humans weren't required, so their skills become obsolete and they get removed from their job. Then there's the third one, the cyclical unemployment. This is the unemployment that happens in recessions or due to economic downturns. We'll talk about what exactly recession and economic downturns are in a few slides. So now the natural rate of unemployment. This talks to the last point about unemployment. So what is the natural rate of unemployment? Well, the natural rate of unemployment is when the economy is the rate at which the economy is healthy, and it only talks about frictional and structural unemployment. If the country is at its natural rate of unemployment, that means it's perfectly healthy. It's a good running economy. Well, this is actually also the lowest that the unemployment can be. The unemployment rate can never be zero. And why is that? Well, because there will always be frictional unemployment. There will always be people transitioning to jobs, and that for that reason, even though they have a job, they'll still be considered unemployed and the number will never go down totally to zero. But then the unemployment rate might also be sometimes overstated, as we just talked about. They discourage workers in the economy. They want to work but can't find one. Well, they're not being considered part of the unemployment rate, but they are part of the unemployment rate. Like they are unemployed and they want a job, they just can't find one. Sometimes what people also do is they claim that they're unemployed to gain government benefits when they're really not even trying to look for a job. So that would overstate the unemployment rate. But overall, if you're near the natural rate of unemployment, you are more likely to have a good, healthy economy. So now, topic 4, inflation. What is inflation and different ways to calculate it? So inflation. Inflation is a general increase in the prices of goods and services. So for example, we know due to the Russian-Ukraine war, gas prices have gone insanely high. And that's an example of inflation where goods and services prices just rise at a certain rate. And there are many ways to calculate this. The first one we're going to talk about is the Consumer Price Index. So what is a Consumer Price Index? It basically shows how prices have changed over time for the same amount of goods. So basically, we look at 2 years, for example, 2010 and 2011, we look at the goods and we keep the quantity of the goods same. And then we look at the prices and how differently they've changed. And through that, once you calculate that, if you subtract both of them and you multiply by 100, you'll actually get the inflation rate because that's by how much percent the rate of the good went up. So that's the way economists use to calculate inflation. There's also one more way, which is known as the GDP deflator. So this is a number that measures all the prices and converts nominal GDP into basically in its real GDP and multiplies it by 100. So the deflators of 2 years in the similar way can be used to calculate inflation. As you can see, the formulas on the right over here, nominal GDP or real GDP into 100, subtracting 2 years is real GDP, multiplying that by 100 gives you the inflation. If you don't understand this GDP deflator and CPI, don't worry. I'll be making an additional video which shows 2 examples of how this is actually used in a real life scenario. The last topic of the video, the business cycle, which is basically downturns and upturns in the economy. So as you can see over here, this is the standard economic cycle. There are many. So overall, we start over here. Oh, my bad. We start over here, and we go up from here, and we're seeing expanding right now. So what does expanding exactly mean? So an expansion is a time where the economy is actually going to a healthy rate. It's increasing. That means more jobs are being created. They're more basically the economy is inflating, coming back up basically. This is the peak moment. So this is the most it went to. This is the highest point the economy has gone to. So probably at this point, the goods are inflated really high. Basically anyone can get a job. After inflation, usually what happens is it's a rule of the economic cycle that after inflation there has to be a recession. So in a recession, we see people start losing jobs and the economy isn't exactly going through healthy again. And the lowest place exactly where the economy goes, where like it's producing very little, is its trough. And then it goes back expanding again. So as you can see, the economy keeps going through a cycle where it goes through its peaks and troughs and basically keeps expanding and keeps having recessions and downturns in the economy. It's just a constant cycle of how it works. One last point that I would like to mention is that over here, there usually would be a linear line going through this, which is actually the natural rate of unemployment. If at a point, there's always certain points that actually hit on that line, and on that line is basically showing where that's actually the peak economy or the economy is very healthy at those certain points. Hopefully, I cleared some of your doubts about Unit 2 macroeconomics. Thank you for watching.